The city waits in the darkness. The gates stand open, unguarded, and the streets lie still beneath a sky that has watched this place for more than 1,000 years. Rome is quiet tonight, quieter than it has been in all the centuries since a shepherd chose a hill and drew a line in the dust. The empire that grew from that hill has spread across 3 continents, touched millions of lives, and shaped the world in ways that will echo long after the last legion marches home. But tonight, at this moment, the city simply waits. To understand how Rome arrived at this threshold, how it grew from 7 hills beside a river into something that could be called eternal, we need to walk back through all those centuries, every emperor, every turning point, every choice that built this vast structure of stone and law and memory. We need to return to the beginning, to the river itself, to the myths that became history and the history that became myth. The story begins with 2 brothers and a basket floating on the Tiber. Romulus and Remus were twins, so the tale goes, abandoned as infants and left to die. The river carried them downstream until they washed ashore beneath a fig tree at the base of a hill. A she-wolf found them there, nursed them, and kept them alive until a shepherd discovered the boys and raised them as his own. When they grew to manhood, they decided to found a city near the place where the wolf had saved them. But they could not agree on which hill to choose. Romulus favored the Palatine, while Remus preferred the Aventine. They watched for signs from the gods, and Romulus saw more vultures in the sky, claiming the divine favor for his choice. The brothers quarreled, and in the heat of that quarrel, Romulus killed Remus. He drew a line around the Palatine Hill and declared that anyone who crossed his boundary would meet the same fate. The city was born in violence, marked by fratricide, named for the brother who survived. The date, according to tradition, was the 21st of April in the year that would later be counted as 753 before the Common Era. But a city of one man cannot endure. Romulus needed people, families, continuity. He opened Rome as a sanctuary for outlaws, exiles, and refugees from neighboring settlements. Men came, but few women. So Romulus invited the nearby Sabines to a festival, and during the celebrations, the Romans seized the Sabine women and carried them away. The Sabine men gathered their forces and marched on Rome, ready to reclaim their daughters by force. War seemed certain until the women themselves intervened. They had married Roman men, born Roman children, and they stood between the 2 armies and pleaded for peace. The Sabines and Romans agreed to unite, sharing the city and its governance. What had begun with violence and abduction became an alliance built through kinship. This story, whether true in detail or true in spirit, taught the Romans something about themselves. They were not a pure people descended from a single ancestor. They were a mixture, a gathering of tribes and families who had chosen to become one city, one identity. The 7 hills rose along the eastern bank of the Tiber, each with its own character, its own early settlements. The Palatine held the first homes, the Capitoline became sacred ground, and the others filled in gradually as the population grew. Around them lived the Latins, people who spoke a similar language and worshipped similar gods, and beyond the Latins were the Etruscans, a more advanced civilization to the north. The Etruscans had cities with paved streets, drainage systems, and elaborate tombs. They practiced divination by examining the entrails of animals and the flight of birds, reading the will of heaven in the world around them. They had kings who wore purple robes and carried fasces, bundles of rods with an axe at the center, symbols of authority and the power to punish. This Etruscan influence flowed into Rome. The early city adopted the practice of augury, taking omens before major decisions. It learned engineering from Etruscan builders who drained the marshy ground between the hills and created the forum, a public space for commerce and assembly, and Rome accepted Etruscan kings. The last of these kings was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He ruled without consulting the Senate, used violence to silence opposition, and treated Rome as his personal possession. His reign might have continued indefinitely, but his son committed an act that shattered the arrangement. The young Tarquin raped Lucretia, the wife of a Roman nobleman. Lucretia told her husband and father what had happened, made them swear to avenge her honor, and then took her own life. Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, carried her body into the Forum and called upon the people to rise against the monarchy. The Romans drove out the Tarquin family, vowing never again to be ruled by a king. The year was traditionally counted as 509 before the Common Era. Rome had defined itself through rejection, through saying what it would not be. It would not bow to tyranny. It would not tolerate absolute power in the hands of one man. The experiment that followed would test whether a city could govern itself without a monarch, whether shared authority could provide both stability and freedom. The Romans replaced their king with two consuls, magistrates elected each year with equal power, each able to veto the other. This division prevented any one man from accumulating too much authority. The Senate, a council of elder statesmen from prominent families, advised the consuls and guided policy. The people assembled in groups to vote on laws and elect magistrates, though these assemblies were weighted in favor of the wealthy. It was a government of checks and balances, of shared responsibility, and it was deeply unstable in its early decades. The patricians, the old aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to the earliest days of the city, held most of the power. The plebeians, the common people who made up the majority of the population, found themselves excluded from high office and burdened with debt. When war came, the plebeians fought in the legions, but when they returned home, they had no legal protections and no voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. The struggle between these two orders defined the early republic. The plebeians threatened to secede, to leave Rome entirely, and found a new city where they would not be oppressed. Faced with the loss of their army and their labor force, the patricians made concessions. They agreed to create the office of tribune of the plebs, a magistrate chosen from among the common people who could veto any action by the consuls or senate if it harmed plebeian interests. The tribune's person was sacrosanct, meaning that anyone who harmed or threatened a tribune could be killed without trial. This gave the plebeians a weapon, a way to protect themselves within the system. Then came the demand for written law. The patricians had controlled legal interpretation, using their knowledge as a tool of power. In response, Rome created the 12 Tables, a code of laws inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum where anyone could read them. The laws were harsh by later standards, but they were public and knowable. Rights were delineated, procedures were established, and the arbitrary power of the aristocracy was limited, if not eliminated. The Republic also created the office of dictator, not as a permanent position, but as an emergency measure. In times of crisis, the consuls could appoint a dictator with absolute authority for a period of no more than 6 months. The dictator's task was to resolve the emergency and then resign, returning power to the regular magistrates. The ideal was embodied by Cincinnatus, a farmer who was called from his plough to lead Rome against an enemy, won the war, and returned to his fields within 16 days. This story, like so many Roman stories, taught a lesson. Power was a burden to be endured, not a prize to be hoarded. Service to the state was the highest virtue, and when that service was complete, a good Roman stepped aside. While Rome built its institutions, it fought for survival. The Latin League, A confederation of cities that shared Rome's language and culture saw the growing city as a threat. The Etruscans, who had once ruled Rome, sought to reclaim their influence. Wars were frequent, brutal, and close to home. Roman armies marched out from the city gates in the spring and returned before winter, fighting within a day's walk of their farms and families. These were not wars of conquest in the early years, but wars of defense and dominance within a small region. Rome won some battles and lost others, but it learned from every encounter. It adapted its tactics, absorbed its enemies' strengths, and built alliances with the defeated. Slowly, methodically, it became the strongest power in Latium. The next great test came from the south, from the Samnites, a confederation of mountain tribes who controlled the fertile lands of Campania and the rugged interior of the Italian peninsula. The Samnite Wars stretched over more than 50 years, three separate conflicts that taught Rome how to fight in difficult terrain against an enemy that refused to meet them in open battle. The Samnites used ambushes, hit-and-run tactics, and their knowledge of the mountains to frustrate Roman armies. At the Caudine Forks, a narrow pass between steep hills, the Samnites trapped an entire Roman army. The Romans were forced to surrender and pass under a yoke made of spears, a ritual of humiliation that scarred the national memory. But Rome did not break. It rebuilt its army, adapted its tactics, and returned to the fight. The key innovation was the Manipular Legion, a reorganization that replaced the rigid phalanx with smaller, more flexible units called maniples. Each maniple could move independently, adapt to the terrain, and support its neighbors. The legion became a responsive organism rather than a single unwieldy block of men. This flexibility allowed Roman armies to fight in the forests and hills of central Italy, to pursue guerrilla fighters and hold ground against superior numbers. The Samnites were eventually defeated, their cities incorporated into Rome's growing sphere of influence. The Latin War, fought during this same period, ended with Rome dissolving the Latin League and creating a new system of alliance. Some cities were granted full Roman citizenship, others received partial rights, and still others became allies bound by treaty to provide troops in time of war, but allowed to govern themselves in peace. This municipal system became one of Rome's most powerful tools. It integrated conquered peoples without requiring them to give up their identities entirely, and it created a network of loyalty that spread across Italy. Roads were built to connect these cities to Rome, and the most famous of these was the Via Appia, a paved highway that ran south through Latium and Campania, allowing armies to move quickly and trade to flow freely. The roads bound Italy together, making it possible to think of the peninsula as a single entity rather than a patchwork of rival cities. Then came Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek king who crossed the Adriatic Sea to aid the Greek cities of southern Italy against Roman expansion. Pyrrhus was a skilled general, a student of Alexander the Great's tactics, and he brought with him something the Romans had never faced: war elephants. These massive animals terrified the Roman horses and broke the lines of infantry in the first encounters. Pyrrhus won his battles, but he lost so many men in the process that he reportedly said one more such victory would destroy him entirely. The phrase Pyrrhic victory entered the language, a reminder that winning at too high a cost is no victory at all. Rome endured the losses, replaced its casualties, and kept fighting. Pyrrhus eventually returned to Greece, his resources exhausted, and the Greek cities of Italy fell under Roman control. Rome had mastered the Italian peninsula, from the Po River in the north to the Straits of Messina in the south. It was now a regional power, and its gaze turned westward, across the water, towards Sicily. Sicily was the prize, and Carthage was the rival. Carthage was a Phoenician city on the North African coast, wealthy beyond measure, with a trading network that spanned the western Mediterranean. Its navy was the finest in the world. Its merchant fleets brought goods from Spain, Africa, and the islands between. Rome, by contrast, had no navy at all. The Romans were farmers and soldiers, men who fought on land with shields and swords. But they decided to challenge Carthage for control of Sicily, and that decision required them to become something they had never been before. They had to learn to build ships, to train sailors, to fight on the water as they had always fought on land. The story goes that they captured a Carthaginian warship that had run aground, took it apart to understand its construction, and used it as a model to build their own fleet. They trained their crews on rowing benches set up on land, practicing the motions before they ever touched the sea. And they invented a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike at the end that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, locking the two vessels together. This turned sea battles into infantry fights, allowing Roman soldiers to board enemy ships and fight hand to hand. It was an innovation born of necessity, a way to play to Roman strengths in an unfamiliar environment. The First Punic War lasted more than 20 years. The Romans fought at sea with mixed results, winning victories at Mylae and Ecnomus, but losing entire fleets to storms and shipwrecks. The financial strain was enormous. The state treasury could not fund the construction of so many ships, so private citizens contributed their wealth, building vessels at their own expense in the hope of reimbursement when the war was won. This collective effort, this willingness to pour resources into a seemingly endless conflict, speaks to something deep in the Roman character. They did not know how to quit. They did not accept defeat as final. When a fleet was destroyed, they built another. When an army was lost, they raised a new one. The war became a grind, a test of endurance rather than brilliance, and Rome proved to have a deeper reservoir of endurance than Carthage. The peace terms gave Rome control of Sicily, its first province outside the Italian mainland. The island was placed under Roman administration, its taxes flowing to Rome, its people governed by Roman magistrates. The Republic had become something more than a city-state. It had become an empire. Success at sea invited a greater collision on land, and that collision came in the form of Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian general who had sworn as a child to be Rome's enemy for life. Hannibal struck at the city of Saguntum in Spain, a Roman ally, knowing that Rome would respond. When Rome declared war, Hannibal did not wait for Roman armies to come to him. He marched from Spain, across southern Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy, bringing his army, his cavalry, and his war elephants into the heart of Roman territory. The crossing of the Alps was an ordeal. The mountain passes were narrow and treacherous, the cold was brutal, and landslides and attacks from mountain tribes thinned the army with each passing day. The elephants, magnificent and terrifying in the lowlands, suffered in the high passes, and most of them died before reaching Italy. But Hannibal arrived with enough force to threaten Rome itself, and he carried with him a plan to destroy the Republic by turning its own allies against it. He met the Romans at the Trebia River, luring them into an ambush in the icy water, and crushed them with a combination of cavalry and infantry coordination that the Romans had not anticipated. He met them again at Lake Trasimene, hiding his army in the hills above the road and falling upon the Roman column as it marched along the shore. Thousands of Romans died in the water or on the muddy banks, and the defeat sent shockwaves through Italy. But it was at Cannae that Hannibal achieved his masterpiece. He faced a Roman army larger than his own, and he drew them into a trap. His center, weaker than his flanks, gave ground slowly, bending backward as the Romans pushed forward. The Roman legions pressed into the gap, confident of victory, and Hannibal's cavalry swept around the flanks and closed the circle behind them. The Romans were surrounded, compressed into a mass so tight that they could barely lift their weapons. The slaughter lasted hours, and when it was over, tens of thousands of Romans lay dead on the field. It was the worst defeat in Roman history, a catastrophe that should have broken the Republic beyond repair. But Rome endured. The Senate met and refused to negotiate. The people did not riot or despair. Instead, they raised new armies, called up older men and younger boys, armed slaves, and promised them freedom if they fought. And they found a general who understood that Hannibal could not be beaten in open battle, a man named Fabius who earned the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. Fabius refused to give Hannibal the pitched battle he needed. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginian army, harassed its foragers, cut off its supplies, and avoided direct engagement. This strategy was unpopular, seen by some as cowardice, but it saved the Republic. It bought time for Rome to recover, to train new soldiers, to shore up its alliances. And those alliances held. Hannibal had hoped that Rome's Italian allies would abandon the Republic and join him, but most of them remained loyal. The city of Capua defected, and a few others followed, but the majority stayed with Rome. This loyalty was the product of the municipal system, the bonds of kinship and mutual obligation that Rome had built over centuries. The Italian cities had grievances, but they had also been integrated into the Roman system, and they chose to endure the crisis together rather than gamble on Hannibal's promises. Rome found its answer to Hannibal not in Italy, but in the career of Publius Cornelius Scipio, a young general who took the war to Spain. Scipio landed in Spain and quickly captured the city of New Carthage, Carthage's main base in the region. He did this through a combination of audacity and careful planning, learning that the lagoon protecting the city became shallow at low tide, and sending troops to wade across while his main force attacked the walls. The city fell, and with it, Carthage's control of Spain began to crumble. Scipio combined military skill with diplomatic intelligence. He treated captured enemies with respect, returned hostages to their tribes without ransom, and won allies among the Spanish and Numidian peoples who had served Carthage. One of these allies was Massinissa, a Numidian prince whose cavalry would prove decisive in the coming years. Scipio, then, did what no Roman general had dared to do since the war began. He took the fight to Africa, landing near Carthage and threatening the city itself. Hannibal, who had spent more than a decade in Italy, was recalled to defend his homeland. The two generals met at Zama in a battle that would decide the war. Hannibal's elephants, sent forward to break the Roman lines, were channeled into corridors between the Roman maniples, rendered ineffective by Scipio's tactical adjustments. Massinissa's cavalry, fighting for Rome, drove off the Carthaginian horsemen and returned to strike Hannibal's infantry from behind. The pattern of Cannae was reversed, and this time it was the Carthaginians who were surrounded and broken. Hannibal survived the battle, but Carthage sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage was disarmed, its navy reduced to a handful of ships, its territory in Spain and the islands ceded to Rome. Indemnities were imposed, payments that would drain Carthaginian wealth for generations. Rome emerged from the Second Punic War as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, its army proven in the most brutal of tests, its people hardened by years of sacrifice. The war had taught Rome the value of resilience, the importance of adaptation, and the danger of showing mercy to a determined enemy. Carthage was crippled, and Rome's appetite for expansion, whetted by victory, turned eastward. The Eastern Mediterranean was a world of Greek-speaking kingdoms, the successors to Alexander the Great's empire. Philip V of Macedon and Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire saw Rome as a rising threat and an opportunity. They had supported Hannibal in subtle ways, and now Rome had a pretext to intervene in their affairs. The Romans crossed the Adriatic and met Philip's army at Cynoscephaly, a battle that tested the legion against the Macedonian phalanx. The phalanx was a wall of spears, nearly impenetrable from the front, but it was rigid and slow to maneuver. The Roman maniples flowed around the phalanx, struck at its flanks and rear, and broke it apart. Philip was defeated, and Rome declared itself the liberator of Greece, proclaiming the freedom of the Greek cities at the Isthmian Games. This proclamation was met with cheers, but the freedom Rome offered was conditional. The cities were free from Macedonian rule, but they were expected to align with Roman interests, to accept Roman arbitration in their disputes, and to remember who held the real power. Antiochus III, ruling from Syria, made the mistake of challenging Rome in Greece and Asia Minor. The Romans met him at Magnesia, where the Seleucid army, larger and more diverse, collapsed under Roman pressure. Antiochus was forced to accept peace, to pay indemnities, to surrender his war elephants and his fleet, and to withdraw from Western Asia Minor. Rome did not annex his territory, not yet, but it established client kingdoms, installed friendly rulers, and collected tribute. This was a different kind of empire, one built on soft power, on obligations and relationships rather than direct administration. It was also profitable. The wealth of the East flowed into Rome, gold and silver, art and slaves, luxuries that had been unimaginable a generation before. Greek culture came with that wealth. Greek tutors taught Roman children, Greek philosophers lectured in the forum, and Greek art filled the homes of the wealthy. Some Romans embraced this influence, seeing in Greek learning a refinement that their own austere traditions lacked. Others resisted, fearing that Greek decadence would corrupt Roman virtue. Cato the Elder spoke against Greek philosophy, insisting that Rome's strength lay in its simplicity, its discipline, its rejection of luxury. But the tide could not be turned. Rome was changing, its identity shifting under the weight of prosperity and empire. The old republican ideals of farmer soldiers and modest living were becoming harder to sustain in a world where senators owned vast estates and commanded armies in distant lands. Wealth flowed into Italy, and with it came slaves, captives taken in the wars of expansion. These slaves worked the fields, the mines, the workshops, and the great estates that began to dominate the Italian countryside. Small farmers, who had once formed the backbone of the Roman army, found themselves unable to compete with the cheap labor of the estates. They sold their land, often to wealthy investors, and drifted to the cities in search of work. The displacement created a new class of urban poor, landless citizens who depended on grain distributions and had little stake in the republic beyond the right to vote. The vast estates, called latifundia, spread across Italy, efficient and profitable, but dependent on an ever-growing supply of slaves. The slaves themselves were not passive. They resisted, ran away, and sometimes rebelled. The conditions of slavery varied widely, but for those who worked in the mines or on the latifundia, life was brutal and short. Revolts were put down with extreme violence, the survivors crucified along the roads as a warning to others. Yet the system persisted because it was enormously profitable for those who controlled it. The concentration of wealth in fewer hands created tensions within the citizen body, and those tensions began to express themselves politically. Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the plebs, proposed a law to redistribute public land to landless citizens. Much of this land had been leased to wealthy families who treated it as their own property, and Gracchus argued that it should be returned to the people and parceled out to those who had none. His proposal threatened powerful interests, and when the Senate opposed him, Gracchus bypassed the Senate and took his law directly to the popular assembly. He was re-elected as tribune, breaking the norm of serving only one term, and his opponents, fearing that he intended to establish himself as a tyrant, organized a mob that killed him and many of his supporters. This was the first time in the Republic's history that political violence on such a scale had occurred in Rome itself. The sacred norms that had restrained conflict, the idea that political disputes would be settled through debate and voting rather than bloodshed, began to erode. Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius's younger brother, took up the cause a decade later. He proposed even broader reforms, including grain subsidies for the urban poor, colonies for landless citizens, and the extension of citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. Gaius was more politically skilled than his brother, building coalitions and using the tribunate to enact a sweeping legislative program. But he too faced opposition from the Senate, and when violence broke out, he was killed along with thousands of his followers. The Gracchi had failed to achieve lasting reform, but they had established a pattern. Ambitious politicians could appeal directly to the people, bypassing the Senate, and use the tribunate as a platform for radical change. They had also shown that violence could be used to settle political disputes, that sacred norms could be broken if the stakes were high enough. The Italian allies, who had fought beside Rome for centuries, watched these events with growing frustration. They had provided troops, paid taxes, and received in return a subordinate status. They wanted citizenship, the legal protections and political rights that came with being Roman. When their demands were refused, they prepared for war. The social war, named for the Latin word for allies, erupted across Italy. Entire regions rose against Rome, forming their own confederation with its own capital and its own government. The war was brutal and close, fought between men who had served in the same armies and knew each other's tactics. Rome won, but only by making concessions. Citizenship was extended to the allies who laid down their arms, and the rebellion ended not in conquest, but in integration. Italy became Roman, and the citizen body expanded enormously, creating administrative challenges and new political dynamics. The crisis also created military leaders whose careers were built on war and whose soldiers were loyal to them personally rather than to the state. Gaius Marius, a general who had risen from outside the old aristocracy, reformed the army by eliminating the property requirement for service. Previously, only men who owned land could serve in the legions, on the theory that they had a stake in defending the Republic. Marius opened the ranks to the landless poor, creating a professional army of men who served for pay and expected land grants when they retired. This made the legions more effective and more flexible, but it also tied them to their commanders. The soldiers looked to their generals for rewards, not to the Senate, and this shift in loyalty would have profound consequences. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was another general whose career was forged in the wars of this period. He fought in Africa, in Italy during the Social War, and in the East against Mithridates VI of Pontus, a king who threatened Roman interests in Asia Minor. When the Senate assigned the Eastern command to Sulla, a political rival used a tribune to transfer the command to Marius instead. Sulla, camped outside Rome with his legions, made a decision that shattered the Republic's unwritten rules. He marched on Rome with his army, the first Roman general ever to do so. His soldiers stormed the city, and Sulla's enemies fled. He restored his command, departed for the east, and left Rome in the hands of his supporters. But when he was gone, his enemies returned, and the cycle of violence continued. Sulla returned victorious from the east and marched on Rome a second time. He declared himself dictator, not for 6 months, but for as long as he deemed necessary. He published lists of his enemies, known as proscriptions, offering rewards for their deaths and confiscating their property. Thousands were killed, their wealth redistributed to Sulla's supporters. The proscriptions were a tool of terror, a way to eliminate opposition and enrich loyalists. Sulla used his dictatorship to enact constitutional reforms, strengthening the Senate's power and weakening the tribunate. He then did something unexpected. He resigned, retired to his country estate, and died a short time later. He had shown that the Republic could be dominated by force, that the rules could be rewritten by whoever held the legions, and then he had walked away. The precedent was set, and the Republic would never fully recover. In the wake of Sulla's dictatorship, new figures emerged to fill the void. Spartacus, a gladiator from Thrace, led a revolt that began in the training school at Capua and grew into a full-scale slave rebellion. Spartacus and his followers defeated Roman armies, raided the countryside, and for a time seemed capable of threatening Rome itself. The revolt drew in tens of thousands of slaves, men and women who saw in Spartacus a chance for freedom. The Senate eventually gave command of the war to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a wealthy senator who had survived Sulla's proscriptions and made a fortune in the chaos. Crassus trained his legions with harsh discipline, even reviving the punishment of decimation, executing 1 in 10 men from units that had fled in battle. He cornered Spartacus in southern Italy and defeated him in a final battle. Pompey, returning from Spain, intercepted and destroyed the remnants of the slave army, claiming credit for ending the rebellion. The survivors, 6,000 of them, were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a warning. The sight of those crosses, stretching for miles, was a spectacle of fear, a message that the Republic would tolerate no challenge to the social order. Crassus and Pompey were rivals, but they were also pragmatists. They joined with Julius Caesar, a rising politician from an old patrician family, to form an informal alliance known to history as the First Triumvirate. It was not a legal arrangement, but a private pact in which each man agreed to support the other's interests. Caesar became consul and pushed through legislation granting land to Pompey's veterans and ratifying his eastern settlements. Pompey, in turn, used his influence to secure for Caesar the governorship of Gaul, a province that offered opportunities for military glory and wealth. To bind the alliance further, Caesar gave his daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey, an age gap that raised eyebrows but served the political purpose. Crassus, the wealthiest of the three, sought military glory to match his riches. He embarked on a campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's rival in the east, and led his army into Mesopotamia. At Carrhae, the Parthian cavalry surrounded and destroyed the Roman legions, killing Crassus and thousands of his men. His death broke the balance of the triumvirate, and the partnership between Caesar and Pompey, already strained, began to unravel. Caesar spent nearly a decade in Gaul, conquering tribes, subduing rebellions, and extending Roman control to the Rhine and the English Channel. He fought the Helvetii as they migrated across Gaul, defeated the German chieftain Augustus, and waged campaigns against the Belgae and other northern tribes. He crossed the Rhine on a bridge his engineers built in 10 days, a demonstration of Roman engineering and a warning to the German tribes beyond. He invaded Britain twice, landing on the island's shores and fighting the Britons in their chariots, though he did not establish permanent control. The most dramatic episode of the Gallic Wars was the siege of Alesia, where the Gallic leader Vercingetorix rallied his people in a final stand against Rome. Caesar surrounded Alesia with a double line of fortifications, one facing inward to besiege the town, and one facing outward to defend against a Gallic relief army. The Romans held both lines, defeated the relief force, and starved the defenders into submission. Vercingetorix surrendered, and Gaul was pacified, though the cost in lives was staggering. Caesar wrote accounts of these campaigns, commentaries that were circulated in Rome and read by the people. They were propaganda, carefully crafted to present Caesar as a brilliant and heroic commander, but they were also well written and compelling. Caesar built his public image through these texts, ensuring that his achievements were known and celebrated even as he remained far from the city. But the Senate grew wary. They ordered Caesar to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen, threatening him with prosecution for illegal acts during his consulship. Caesar knew that if he obeyed, his enemies would destroy him in the courts. He faced a choice: submit and risk ruin, or defy the Senate and march on Rome. He chose defiance. On a winter night in the year traditionally counted as 49 before the Common Era, Caesar led his legions across the Rubicon, a small river that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper. To cross with an army was treason, and Caesar knew it. The phrase attributed to him, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, captured the irrevocability of the decision. There was no turning back. Caesar's army moved swiftly down the Italian peninsula, and town after town opened its gates to him. Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece, taking with them the legitimacy of the Republic, but leaving Italy in Caesar's hands. The civil war that followed was fought across the Mediterranean, in Greece, Egypt, Africa, and Spain, a conflict that drew in the entire Roman world. The decisive battle came at Pharsalus in Greece, where Caesar's outnumbered legions faced Pompey's larger force. Pompey's cavalry, superior in numbers, attempted to flank Caesar's line, but Caesar had prepared a reserve and threw it into the fight at the critical moment. The cavalry was driven off, and Pompey's infantry, seeing the flank collapse, began to waver. The battle turned into a rout, and Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with the young King Ptolemy. The Egyptians, hoping to win Caesar's favor, murdered Pompey and presented his head to Caesar when he arrived. Caesar, it is said, wept at the sight. Whether from genuine grief or political theater is uncertain. He remained in Egypt, became entangled in the court politics of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and formed an alliance with Cleopatra, the young queen who sought to secure her throne against her brother. Caesar returned to Rome and fought more battles, mopping up the remnants of Pompey's faction at Thapsus in Africa and Munda in Spain. He was made dictator, and unlike Sulla, he did not step down. He took the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, and began a program of reforms. He restructured the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that would endure for centuries. He granted citizenship to many provincials, expanded the Senate to include men from outside the traditional aristocracy, and initiated public works projects to employ the urban poor. He showed clemency to many of his enemies, pardoning them and even appointing some to positions of authority. But clemency, however magnanimous, did not erase the fear among the old aristocracy that Caesar intended to make himself king. The title of king was anathema to Romans, a reminder of the Tarquins and the tyranny that the Republic had been founded to escape. Caesar refused the crown when it was offered publicly, but the suspicion remained. A conspiracy formed among senators who saw themselves as defenders of the Republic. On the Ides of March, in the year 44 before the Common Era, they surrounded Caesar in the Senate and stabbed him to death. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, his former ally and rival, struck by dozens of blows. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, believed they had saved the Republic, but they had only created a vacuum. Caesar's death unleashed another round of civil war. His will named his great-nephew Octavian as his heir, a young man barely out of his teens with no military experience and no political base. But Octavian had Caesar's name, and that name carried immense weight. He raised an army, formed an alliance with Mark Antony, Caesar's most capable lieutenant, and with Lepidus, another of Caesar's generals. The three formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal compact unlike the informal arrangement of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. They divided the Roman world among themselves and set about eliminating their enemies. The proscriptions returned, and this time the most famous victim was Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic. Cicero had opposed Antony in speeches that were brilliant and cutting, and Antony ensured that Cicero's name appeared on the proscription lists. He was hunted down and killed, his head and hands displayed in the forum as a warning to others. The triumvirs then marched east to face Brutus and Cassius, who had gathered an army in Greece. At Philippi, the armies met in two battles. The conspirators were defeated, and both Brutus and Cassius took their own lives. The Republic, in any meaningful sense, was finished. The triumvirate did not last. Lepidus was sidelined, stripped of his power, and left to live out his days in comfortable obscurity. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east, and for a time an uneasy peace held. Antony established himself in Egypt, forming a partnership with Cleopatra that was both political and personal. They had children together, and Antony's behavior, seen from Rome, appeared increasingly un-Roman. He adopted Eastern customs, distributed territories to Cleopatra's children, and seemed to many Romans to have become more Egyptian than Roman. Octavian exploited this perception, portraying Antony as a traitor seduced by a foreign queen, and when war came, it was framed as a conflict between Rome and Egypt, between Roman virtue and Eastern decadence. The fleets met at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, in a naval battle that would decide the future of the Roman world. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, was a skilled commander, and he maneuvered the fleet to block Antony's escape. The battle was not a dramatic clash, but a slow strangulation. Antony's ships were outmatched, and when Cleopatra's squadron broke away and fled, Antony followed her. The remainder of his fleet surrendered, and his army, left without its commander, eventually defected to Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, where Octavian pursued them. Facing inevitable defeat, both took their own lives. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, ended with Cleopatra's death, and Egypt became a Roman province, its grain supply feeding the city of Rome. Octavian returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was careful, though, to avoid the appearance of kingship or dictatorship. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer, a man who had saved the Republic from chaos and was now returning it to the people. In the year 27 before the Common Era, he offered to resign all his powers and return to private life. The Senate, whether out of genuine conviction or political theater, refused to accept his resignation and instead granted him new titles and authorities. He became Augustus, the revered one, and Princeps, the first citizen. His powers were carefully defined, limited in theory but absolute in practice. He held the authority of a tribune, giving him the ability to veto any action and appeal directly to the people. He held imperium, military command over the provinces where most of the legions were stationed. And he had auctoritas, a moral authority that came from his achievements and his name. This was the settlement that transformed the Republic into the Principate, a system in which one man held supreme power but operated within the framework of republican institutions. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates were still elected, and the forms of the old republic were preserved. But real power rested with Augustus, and everyone knew it. He enacted moral legislation, attempting to restore what he saw as traditional Roman values. Laws encouraged marriage and childbearing among the upper classes, penalized adultery, and promoted a return to the simplicity and piety of earlier generations. He rebuilt temples throughout the city, funded public works, and patronized poets like Virgil and Horace, who celebrated the new age in verse. The message was clear. The civil wars were over, peace had returned, and Rome had entered a golden age. Augustus called this peace the Pax Romana, and it was more than a slogan. The frontiers were secured, the legions stationed along the Rhine and Danube in the north, the Euphrates in the east, and the deserts of Africa in the south. Within these boundaries, trade flourished, cities grew, and roads connected every corner of the empire. Aqueducts brought water to urban centers, and Roman law provided a framework for commerce and dispute resolution. The empire was not without conflict. There were rebellions and border wars, but the scale of violence was far less than the civil wars that had consumed the previous century. Augustus lived for decades, ruling longer than any Roman leader before him. He wrote an account of his achievements, the Res Gesti, which was inscribed on bronze pillars and displayed throughout the empire. It listed his victories, his donations to the people, the buildings he constructed, and the offices he held. It was a narrative of service, of a man who had given his life to the state and asked for nothing in return, though of course he had been granted everything. But as Augustus aged, the question of succession loomed. He had no son, and he adopted various relatives, training them for leadership only to see them die young. His daughter Julia was exiled for adultery, a personal and political scandal that tarnished the moral program he had tried to build. In the end, he settled on Tiberius, his stepson, a capable but reluctant heir. When Augustus died in the year 14 of the Common Era, Tiberius became emperor, though he did not use that title openly. Tiberius was competent and conscientious, but he was also suspicious and withdrawn. He relied on Sejanus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the elite troops stationed in Rome, and Sejanus used his position to accumulate power and eliminate rivals. When Tiberius learned of Sejanus's treachery, he had him arrested and executed, but the damage to trust was done. Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri, governing the empire from a distance and leaving the administration in the hands of subordinates. Tiberius was succeeded by Caligula, his grandnephew, who began his reign with promise but descended into erratic behavior and cruelty. Caligula's actions, whether driven by madness, illness, or deliberate provocation, alienated the Senate and the Praetorian Guard. He was assassinated after only 4 years, and the Guard proclaimed Claudius, his uncle, as emperor. Claudius was not an obvious choice. He had been sidelined by his family, considered weak and unfit, but he proved to be an effective administrator. He conquered Britain, bringing the island into the empire after nearly a century of independence. He reformed the bureaucracy, relying on freedmen, former slaves who had been granted their freedom, to manage the day-to-day operations of government. This reliance on freedmen caused resentment among the traditional aristocracy, who saw these men as beneath them, but it also made the administration more efficient. Claudius was succeeded by Nero, his stepson, whose reign began with competence under the guidance of the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. But as Nero matured, he indulged his artistic ambitions, and his paranoia. The Great Fire of Rome in the year 64 destroyed much of the city, and Nero used the opportunity to rebuild on a grand scale, including a vast palace complex for himself. Rumors spread that he had started the fire, and to deflect blame, he scapegoated the Christians, a small and unpopular sect, subjecting them to brutal persecution. Nero's extravagance, his neglect of military affairs, and his willingness to execute senators on suspicion of treason led to rebellions in the provinces. The legions in Gaul and Spain proclaimed their own commanders as emperor, and the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. He fled Rome and took his own life, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The year that followed, 68 to 69 of the Common Era, saw four men claim the throne in rapid succession. Galba I was a stern disciplinarian who alienated the Praetorian Guard by refusing to pay them the bonuses they expected. They murdered him and proclaimed Otho, who had supported Nero. But Vitellius, commander of the legions on the Rhine, marched on Italy and defeated Otho's forces. Otho took his own life, and Vitellius entered Rome as emperor. Meanwhile, the legions in the east, those stationed in Judea and Syria, declared for Vespasian, their commander, who had been prosecuting the war against the Jewish revolt. Vespasian's forces marched west, defeated Vitellius, and Vespasian became emperor, founding the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian was a practical man from a non-aristocratic background, and he brought a sense of order and fiscal responsibility to the empire. He raised taxes, restored the treasury, and began a building program that included the amphitheater known to later generations as the Colosseum. This massive structure, capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators, was built on the site of Nero's palace, a symbolic reclamation of public space from imperial excess. Public spectacles, gladiatorial games, and animal hunts were not mere entertainment but political tools, ways to win the favor of the urban population and demonstrate the emperor's generosity and power. Vespasian was succeeded by his son Titus, who reigned for only 2 years but faced a series of disasters. Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and preserving them for future ages. A fire swept through Rome, and a plague followed. Titus responded with relief efforts, using his personal wealth to aid the victims, and he was remembered fondly for his compassion. His brother Domitian succeeded him and ruled for 15 years. Domitian was effective in administration and military affairs, securing the frontiers and improving the bureaucracy, but he was also autocratic and paranoid. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and he prosecuted senators he suspected of disloyalty. His reign ended in assassination, and the Senate, eager to distance itself from his memory, declared his acts void and his name erased from public records. The Senate chose Nerva, an elderly senator, as emperor, hoping for a brief and uneventful reign. Nerva adopted Trajan, the commander of the legions on the Rhine, as his son and heir, ensuring a smooth succession. This set a precedent for the next century, the practice of emperors adopting capable successors rather than relying on biological heirs. Trajan was the first emperor born outside Italy, from a Roman family in Spain, and his reign marked the high point of Roman expansion. He conquered Dacia, a kingdom north of the Danube rich in gold, and annexed it as a province. The wealth from Dacia funded massive building projects in Rome, including Trajan's Forum and Trajan's Column, a monument depicting his victories in intricate relief. Trajan also campaigned in the east, invading Parthia and capturing the capital of Ctesiphon, but he could not hold the territory. He died on the way back to Rome, and his adopted son Hadrian became emperor. Hadrian was a different kind of ruler. He abandoned Trajan's eastern conquests, recognizing that they could not be held without draining the empire's resources. He traveled extensively, visiting nearly every province, inspecting the frontiers, and ensuring that the defenses were strong. In Britain, he ordered the construction of a wall across the narrow waist of the island, a physical barrier to mark the edge of Roman territory and control the movement of people and goods. Hadrian's Wall became a symbol of Roman limits, an acknowledgement that the empire could not expand indefinitely. Hadrian also promoted Greek culture, building temples and libraries, and he had a personal attachment to Greece that was unusual for a Roman emperor. He standardized practices across the empire, codifying laws and regulations to ensure consistency. Hadrian was succeeded by Antoninus Pius, whose reign was peaceful and prosperous. Antoninus did not campaign or travel widely, governing from Rome and allowing the administrative systems to function smoothly. His adopted son, Marcus Aurelius, succeeded him and faced a very different reality. Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher, a follower of Stoic teachings who wrote meditations on duty, virtue, and the nature of existence. But his reign was marked by constant warfare. The Marcomanni and other Germanic tribes pressed on the Danube frontier, breaching the defenses and raiding into Italy itself. Marcus spent years on campaign, fighting and negotiating, and he wrote his philosophical reflections in a tent on the frontier. He was succeeded by his biological son, Commodus, breaking the pattern of adoptive succession. Commodus was uninterested in governance and obsessed with gladiatorial combat, often fighting in the arena himself. His behavior scandalized the Senate, and he was eventually strangled by a wrestling partner in a conspiracy organized by his own court. The death of Commodus led to another civil war, with rival generals competing for the throne. Septimius Severus, commander of the Pannonian legions, emerged victorious. He marched on Rome, defeated his rivals, and established the Severan dynasty. Severus was a military man who understood that power rested with the legions. He raised soldiers' pay, improved their conditions, and ensured their loyalty. He told his sons on his deathbed to enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else. This advice shaped the dynasty. The empire became, more explicitly than before, a military monarchy, with the emperor's legitimacy dependent on the army's support. Severus was succeeded by his son Caracalla, who is remembered for two things. First, he issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire. This was partly a fiscal measure, as citizens paid certain taxes that non-citizens did not. But it also represented the culmination of a process that had been unfolding for centuries, the integration of the provinces into a single political and legal community. Second, Caracalla was brutal and paranoid, murdering his own brother and co-emperor, and eventually he was assassinated by one of his own officers. The Severan dynasty continued through a series of rulers, some competent, some bizarre. Elagabalus, a teenage priest of a Syrian sun god, brought his religious practices to Rome and alienated the Senate and the people with his unconventional behavior. He was murdered, and his cousin Severus Alexander became emperor. Severus Alexander faced renewed pressure from the Sassanid Persians, who had replaced the Parthians as Rome's eastern rival, and from Germanic tribes in the north. He was killed by his own soldiers during a mutiny, and with his death, the Severan dynasty ended. What followed was the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of chaos that lasted nearly 50 years. Emperors rose and fell with astonishing speed, most of them generals proclaimed by their troops and then killed by rivals or their own men. The title of emperor became almost meaningless, a label for whoever controlled the largest army at any given moment. Plagues swept through the empire, killing millions and disrupting trade and agriculture. The currency was debased, with emperors reducing the silver content of coins to pay their soldiers, causing inflation and economic instability. The frontiers collapsed in places, with Gothic and Alemannic tribes raiding deep into the empire, even reaching Italy and Greece. Cities that had not needed walls for centuries began to fortify themselves, and the sense of security that had defined the Pax Romana evaporated. In the east, Zenobia, the queen of Palmyra, a wealthy trading city, took advantage of Roman weakness to carve out her own empire, conquering Egypt and much of the eastern provinces. In the west, a series of generals declared a Gallic empire, independent of Rome, controlling Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain. The Roman Empire seemed to be fragmenting, breaking into regional powers that acknowledged no central authority. But the empire did not collapse entirely. Aurelian, a soldier who rose through the ranks, became emperor and set about restoring Roman control. He defeated the Goths, reconquered Palmyra and captured Zenobia, and then turned west to reclaim the Gallic Empire. He was called Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, and he built new walls around Rome itself, a recognition that even the capital was no longer safe. Aurelian's reign was brief. He was assassinated by his own officers, but he had stabilized the empire enough for a more lasting solution to be attempted. That solution came from Diocletian, a soldier from a humble background who became emperor in 284. Diocletian recognized that the empire was too large for one man to govern effectively, especially in a time of constant military threats. He divided power, appointing a co-emperor, Maximian, to rule the western half of the empire while he governed the east. Each emperor then appointed a junior partner, a Caesar, who would assist in administration and eventually succeed as Augustus. This system, known as the Tetrarchy, the rule of four, was designed to provide continuity and prevent the rapid turnover of emperors that had plagued the previous decades. Diocletian reorganized the administration, dividing provinces into smaller units called dioceses, making them easier to govern and harder for provincial governors to use as bases for rebellion. He reformed the tax system, conducting a new census and standardizing rates across the empire. He attempted to control inflation with the Price Edict, a law that set maximum prices for goods and services throughout the empire. The edict was difficult to enforce and had limited success, but it reflected Diocletian's ambition to impose order on a chaotic economy. He also reorganized the military, creating mobile field armies that could respond to threats quickly while maintaining frontier garrisons to hold the borders. This dual structure increased the size of the army significantly, which in turn increased the financial burden on the empire's inhabitants. Diocletian is also remembered for the last and most severe persecution of Christians. Christianity had spread steadily over the centuries, attracting followers from all levels of society, and it had survived earlier persecutions. Diocletian, concerned about religious unity and suspicious of a faith that refused to honor the traditional gods, ordered Christians to sacrifice to the Roman gods or face punishment. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and those who refused to comply were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. The persecution lasted several years, but it did not destroy Christianity. In fact, it may have strengthened the faith, creating martyrs whose stories inspired others. Diocletian abdicated in 305, along with Maximian, in a planned succession that was supposed to demonstrate the viability of the Tetrarchy. But the system did not survive his retirement. The Caesars became Augusti, new Caesars were appointed, and then civil war broke out as rivals fought for supreme power. Constantine, the son of one of the original Caesars, emerged as the dominant figure in the West. He fought a series of battles against rival claimants, and in 312 he faced Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. According to later accounts, Constantine had a vision before the battle, seeing a symbol in the sky and hearing a voice that told him to conquer under that sign. He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, the Chi, and he won the battle. Whether the vision was genuine or a later invention, Constantine's victory was interpreted as a sign of divine favor, and he began to favor Christianity openly. In 313, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which granted toleration to Christians and ended the persecutions. Christianity was no longer illegal, and Constantine began to patronize the church, funding the construction of basilicas and granting privileges to clergy. He did not make Christianity the official religion of the empire that would come later, but he set it on a path to dominance. In 325, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the empire to settle disputes over doctrine, particularly the nature of Christ. The council produced the Nicene Creed, a statement of belief that became a foundation of Christian orthodoxy, and Constantine presided over the proceedings, inserting the imperial authority into theological matters. Constantine also founded a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium. The location was strategic, controlling the strait between Europe and Asia, and it was closer to the empire's wealthiest provinces and the most active frontiers. Constantinople was built as a Christian city from the beginning, with churches rather than temples as its focal points. It was also a rival to Rome, a statement that the center of power had shifted eastward. Constantine introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, which remained stable for centuries and became the standard currency of Mediterranean trade. His reign saw relative stability, though his family life was marked by tragedy. He executed his eldest son on suspicion of treason and later his own wife, decisions that haunted his legacy. When Constantine died in 337, he was baptized on his deathbed, and the empire was divided among his three sons. The sons of Constantine fought among themselves, eliminating rivals and eventually ruling their respective territories in an uneasy peace. Julian, Constantine's nephew, became emperor in 361 and attempted to reverse the Christianization of the empire. Julian had been raised Christian but converted to paganism, and he tried to restore the traditional cults and weaken the church. His efforts were short-lived. He died in battle against the Persians in 363, and his pagan revival died with him. The empire returned to Christian emperors, and the trend towards state support of the church continued. Valentinian and Valens, brothers who ruled the west and east respectively, faced mounting pressure from barbarian tribes. The Goths, displaced by the Huns moving westward from the steppes, sought refuge within the empire. They were allowed to cross the Danube and settle in Roman territory, but they were mistreated by corrupt officials who exploited them and refused to provide the food and supplies that had been promised. The Goths rebelled, and in 378 they met the Eastern Roman army at Adrianople. The battle was a disaster for Rome. The Gothic cavalry shattered the Roman infantry, and Valens himself was killed, possibly burned alive in a farmhouse where he had sought refuge. The defeat at Adrianople shocked the empire. It demonstrated that Rome was no longer invincible, that barbarian armies could defeat Roman legions in open battle. Theodosius, a Spanish general, was made emperor in the east, and set about negotiating a settlement with the Goths. He allowed them to settle within the empire as federates, semi-autonomous allies who would provide troops in exchange for land and payments. This FODUS model became a pattern, a way of managing barbarian groups by incorporating them into the empire's military structure. Theodosius was a devout Christian, and he made Christianity the official religion of the empire, banning pagan worship and closing the temples. He also fought civil wars against usurpers in the west, and at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394, he defeated his last rival, but the victory cost him dearly in men and resources. When Theodosius died in 395, he divided the empire between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This division, though intended as administrative, became permanent. The eastern and western halves of the empire would never again be ruled by a single emperor. Honorius was a weak ruler, dominated by his guardian, Stilicho, a half-Vandal general who commanded the western armies. Stilicho tried to hold the empire together, negotiating with barbarian leaders and deploying his limited forces to defend Italy. But the pressures were overwhelming. Alaric, leader of the Visigoths, had served Rome as a foederatus, but he felt that Rome had not honored its promises. He demanded land for his people, recognition of his authority, and payment for his services. When these demands were refused or delayed, Alaric marched on Italy. Honorius had moved the imperial court to Ravenna, a city protected by marshes and easily defensible, leaving Rome itself exposed. Alaric besieged Rome multiple times, and each time the city's senate negotiated, paying ransoms in gold and silver to buy him off. But the underlying issues were never resolved. In 410, after yet another failed negotiation, Alaric's Visigoths entered Rome and sacked the city. The sack lasted 3 days, and while it was not as destructive as it might have been, Alaric's men were Christians and spared the churches. The psychological impact was enormous. Rome, the eternal city, had not been sacked by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The event sent shockwaves throughout the empire and beyond. Refugees fled to North Africa and the eastern provinces, and intellectuals questioned whether Rome's abandonment of the old gods had brought divine punishment. Augustine of Hippo wrote, "The City of God," in response, arguing that earthly cities rise and fall, but the true city, the spiritual community of believers, endures. Alaric died shortly after the sack, and his people moved on, eventually settling in southern Gaul and Spain. But the Western Empire continued to deteriorate. The Vandals, another Germanic people, crossed from Spain into North Africa, conquering the rich provinces that supplied Rome with grain. The loss of Africa was catastrophic for the Western Empire, cutting off a major source of revenue and food. Aetius, a Roman general who had spent time as a hostage among the Huns and understood their ways, tried to hold the line in Gaul. When Attila the Hun invaded Gaul in 451, Aetius assembled a coalition of Romans and barbarian foederati and met Attila at the Catalonian plains. The battle was inconclusive, both sides suffering heavy losses, but Attila withdrew. He turned toward Italy the following year, but disease and lack of supplies forced him to retreat, and he died. Soon after, the Hunnic threat faded, but Aetius, the last effective Roman general in the West, was murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III, who feared his power. Valentinian was himself murdered shortly thereafter, and the Western Empire descended into chaos. A series of puppet emperors followed, installed and deposed by barbarian generals who held the real power. Ricimer, a general of mixed Visigothic and Suevic descent, controlled the Western Empire for nearly 20 years, making and unmaking emperors as it suited him. The economy collapsed, with the tax base shrinking as provinces drifted out of Roman control. Britain had been abandoned, the legions withdrawn to defend the continent. Gaul and Spain were divided among barbarian kingdoms, the Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, and Suebi. The Western Empire was reduced to Italy and a few scattered territories, and even Italy was not secure. In 476, Odoacer, a leader of Germanic foederati serving in the Roman army, demanded land for his men. When the demand was refused, he mutinied, seized control of Italy, and deposed the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. The name was almost too symbolic, combining the name of Rome's founder with a diminutive of Augustus, the first emperor. Romulus Augustulus was sent into comfortable retirement, and Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown and purple robes, to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, acknowledging that there was now only one emperor ruling from the East. The Senate in Rome accepted this arrangement, and Italy came under the rule of a barbarian king who governed in the name of the Eastern emperor. The year 476 is often given as the date of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but it was not a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet end, a formality that acknowledged a reality that had been unfolding for decades. The Western Empire had fragmented into barbarian kingdoms, and the Roman state in the West had become irrelevant. But the Eastern Empire endured. It would continue for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian theology. Justinian, an Eastern emperor in the 6th century, would reconquer parts of the West, briefly restoring Roman control over North Africa, Italy, and southern Spain. He would also codify Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal code that influenced European law for centuries. The Eastern Empire adapted, shifting from Latin to Greek, reorganizing its military and administration through the thematic system, and surviving waves of invaders, Persians, Arabs, Slavs, and Turks. The story of Rome is not simply a story of rise and fall, but of transformation. The city that began as a cluster of huts on 7 hills became a republic, then an empire, and finally a memory that shaped the world. Roman law provided a framework for justice and governance that influenced legal systems across Europe and beyond. Roman roads, aqueducts, and cities endured long after the legions departed. Latin, the language of Rome, evolved into the Romance languages and remained the language of scholarship and the church for centuries. The idea of Rome, the notion of a universal empire, a res publica, a commonwealth of peoples under a common law, persisted in imagination and aspiration. The quiet at Rome's gates, the stillness of that night so long ago, was not the silence of oblivion but the pause before a new chapter. The empire had become a habit, a way of thinking about law, citizenship, and community that outlasted the crowns and the armies. If you want to drift deeper through another empire's long night, there are more stories waiting, more turnings of the wheel. For a close look at a single moment, at the shock and sorrow of 410, there are paths to follow. But for now, the walk through Rome's long history is complete, and the city waits in the darkness, listening to the echoes of all those centuries, all those voices, all those choices that made it eternal.